Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.
The call came in at 2:53 in the morning. I know because I checked the clock on the forklift display when my phone started buzzing in my back pocket. Third shift at the loading dock meant I was usually done with the personal calls by midnight. Nobody bothered you after that unless something was wrong. I pulled the phone out and saw a number I didn't recognize. Wisconsin area code. Figured it was probably a wrong number, but something made me answer anyway. Maybe it was how persistent the buzzing felt through my jeans. "This is Oliver. Mr. Lopez?" The voice was formal, careful, professional in a way that made me straighten up even though I was standing next to a stack of shipping containers. "This is Kai Porter. I'm an attorney calling from Madison, Wisconsin." I set the clipboard down on the nearest pallet. Lawyers didn't call at 3 in the morning with good news. "What's this about?" "I'm handling the estate of your great-uncle Clay Lopez. I'm calling to inform you that you've been named as his sole beneficiary." That stopped me cold. I walked away from the forklift toward the loading bay door where the night air was coming through. "I think you've got the wrong person. I don't have a great-uncle named Clay. Oliver Thomas Lopez, born January 5th, 1996, in Kenosha. My birth date, my full name. Yeah, that's me. But I'm telling you, I don't know any Clay Lopez." I understand this might come as a surprise. Porter's voice stayed level, like he'd delivered this kind of news before. "Your great-uncle was your grandmother's brother. He passed away last week, and his will specifically names you as the inheritor of his property." I leaned against the concrete wall next to the bay door. The warehouse behind me was quiet, except for the hum of the overhead lights and Jimmy running the other forklift on the far side. "What kind of property?" "A fishing cabin in the surrounding land. It's located in northern Wisconsin, about 2 hours from the nearest town. Quite isolated, according to the property records. 2 hours from civilization. That didn't sound like much of an inheritance. More like a problem waiting to happen." "Why me? I mean, if I never knew the guy existed, why would he leave me anything?" "I'm afraid I can't answer that, Mr. Lopez. I only handled the legal arrangements per his instructions. The property is fully paid for, no outstanding debts or liens. You'd inherit it free and clear." I rubbed my eyes with my free hand. The fluorescent lights in the warehouse were giving me a headache, or maybe it was just the whole situation. "What do I need to do?" "I'll need you to come to my office to sign the paperwork and collect the keys. I can arrange a time that works with your schedule." We set up an appointment for Friday afternoon. I'd have to call in sick, but this seemed important enough. Porter gave me his address and some basic details about the cabin. Built in the 70s, wood frame construction, sits on about 40 acres of forest. Nothing fancy, but solid. After I hung up, I stood there for a minute looking at my phone. The whole conversation felt like something that had happened to someone else. Great-uncle Clay. I tried to picture him, but came up with nothing. My family wasn't the type to talk much about relatives, especially the distant ones. I finished loading the last truck around 4:30. The rest of the shift crawled by. I kept thinking about this cabin sitting in the woods somewhere, apparently waiting for me. It didn't make sense. People don't leave property to relatives they've never met unless there's a reason. By the time I clocked out at 6, I'd decided to call my mom. She'd know about Clay if anyone would. Mom kept track of family stuff, even the parts she didn't like talking about. I drove home to my apartment on the south side and tried calling her around 7. Too early probably, but I couldn't wait. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. "Oliver? What's wrong?" Her voice was sharp with worry. Mom always assumed the worst when I called outside normal hours. "Nothing's wrong. I got some weird news, though. Did you know I had a great-uncle named Clay Lopez?" The pause went on too long. long enough for me to hear the coffee maker gurgling in the background and the morning news playing on her TV. When she finally spoke, her voice had that careful quality it got when she was choosing her words. "Clay? Where did you hear that name?" "A lawyer called me last night, said Clay died and left me some property in Wisconsin, a cabin or something." Another pause, shorter this time, but I could practically hear her thinking. I don't know anything about that. But her voice had changed. It got tighter, like when she used to tell me she hadn't found any beer cans in my room back in high school. That particular strain that meant she was lying to protect me from something. "Mom, I'm telling you, I don't know anything about a cabin. Maybe it's a mistake." The lawyer had my full name, my birthday, everything. Said Clay was Grandma's brother. Your grandmother never mentioned anyone named Clay to me. That might have been true. Grandma Lopez had died when I was 12, and she wasn't much for family stories. But the way Mom's voice kept getting more controlled told me she knew more than she was saying. "So you've never heard the name Clay Lopez?" "No, Oliver, I haven't." The words came out too fast, too definite. "Maybe you should just ignore this whole thing. Sounds like a scam." I leaned back in my kitchen chair and looked out the window at the parking lot. Mrs. Chen from next door was walking her little dog around the dumpster. Normal Tuesday morning stuff. "The lawyer's real, Mom. I looked him up online. Has an office in Madison, been practicing for 20 years. Well, I can't help you. I don't know anything about this Clay person or any cabin." That familiar frustration started building in my chest. The same feeling I got when I was a kid and knew she was keeping something from me for my own good. Like when Dad left and she spent 3 months telling me he was just working out of town. "Mom, if there's something I should know, there's nothing to know. I'm telling you the truth." But she wasn't. I could hear it in every word. The way she kept saying she didn't know anything, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. The strain in her voice was getting worse, not better. Maybe I should ask around, see if anyone else in the family knows about Clay. Don't. The word came out sharp enough to surprise both of us, then softer. I mean, why would you want to bother people with this? If I don't know anything about it, nobody else will, either. That was definitely a lie. Mom knew something about Clay Lopez, and whatever it was, she didn't want me digging into it, which just made me more curious. "I'm going to go sign the paperwork on Friday," I said. "See what this is all about." "Oliver, please, just let this go." "Why? It's a free cabin, Mom. Even if it's falling apart, the land might be worth something." "Some things aren't worth what they cost you." Now that was interesting. She'd gone from claiming total ignorance to suggesting the inheritance might come with problems. "What do you mean?" "Nothing. Be careful, okay? If someone you've never heard of leaves you property, there might be a reason nobody talks about him." There it was. She did know something about Clay, enough to be worried about me getting involved with whatever he'd left behind. "What kind of reason?" "I have to go, Oliver. I'm going to be late for work." It was 7:15 on a Tuesday. Mom worked at the county assessor's office, and they didn't open until 8:30, but she hung up before I could point that out. I sat in my kitchen for a while after that, drinking coffee and thinking about the conversation. Mom was scared. Not just worried or annoyed, actually scared. And she was scared enough to lie to me about it, which meant whatever Clay Lopez had been up to, it wasn't something she wanted me mixed up in. But that just made the whole thing more interesting. I'd been working the same loading dock job for 3 years, living in the same apartment, following the same routine. Nothing interesting ever happened to me. Now some mysterious great uncle I'd never heard of had left me property in the middle of nowhere, and my mom was acting like I'd just inherited a bomb. Maybe I should have listened to her, let the lawyer know I wasn't interested and gone back to my regular life. That would have been the smart thing to do. Instead, I started thinking about this Clay Lopez guy. wondering what kind of person watches a great nephew from a distance for 28 years, then leaves him a cabin in the woods. Wondering what he'd done that made my mom so nervous she couldn't even admit she'd heard his name. The inheritance was supposed to be simple: sign some papers, get some keys, figure out what to do with a cabin I didn't want. But sitting there in my kitchen, listening to the morning traffic pick up outside, I got the feeling nothing about Clay Lopez was going to be simple. He'd been watching me somehow. Had to have been. To know enough about me to leave me anything. That thought bothered me more than I wanted to admit. How long had he been watching? What else did he know about my life? And what was he expecting me to find up there in those 40 acres of Wisconsin forest? Porter's directions weren't the kind you'd find on Google Maps, handwritten on legal pad paper in careful block letters. They read more like treasure hunt clues than actual navigation. Take County Road J North for 12.7 miles past the mobile station. Turn left at the mailbox shaped like a fish. Follow dirt road 2 miles until you see the break in the pine trees. I figured the fish mailbox would be some cutesy lake house thing. Turns out it was just a regular black mailbox with a base welded to the top, painted green and chipping. The whole setup looked like someone's weekend project that had been sitting there for decades. No house number, no name. Just that metal fish pointing down a dirt road that disappeared into thick pine forest. The drive from Madison had taken 3 hours instead of 2. I'd stopped twice to double-check Porter's directions, and once because my Honda started making a noise I didn't recognize. Turned out to be gravel stuck in the brake housing. That's the thing about city cars. They're not built for whatever this was. The dirt road was worse than I expected. Not quite 2 lanes wide, with pine branches scraping my windows and roots that had grown up through the packed earth. My car bounced over ruts that felt deep enough to swallow a tire. I kept the speed down to maybe 15 miles per hour and tried not to think about what I'd do if another car came the other direction. That's when I noticed there weren't any other tire tracks. The road looked like nobody'd driven it in weeks, maybe months. Just my Honda leaving fresh marks in dirt that had been rained on and dried and rained on again. I started wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, if that fish mailbox was pointing toward some abandoned hunting camp instead of Clay's cabin. Then I saw the break in the trees. It opened up sudden, like walking through a doorway. 1 second I was driving through forest so thick I couldn't see 10 feet in any direction, and the next I was looking at 15 acres of cleared land sloping down toward dark water. The lake stretched maybe half a mile across, surrounded by pine forest on all sides. No other cabins visible. No boats. No docks, except for a small wooden platform, maybe 50 feet from shore. The water was black, not dark blue or deep green like the lakes I'd seen in tourism brochures. Actually black, like someone had filled a hole with crude oil. I figured it was just the way afternoon light hit it, but even when clouds moved and the sun came out, the water stayed that same flat black color. And there was the cabin. It sat about 100 yards back from the water, built into a small rise that gave it a view of the whole lake. Log construction like Porter had said, but bigger than I'd pictured. Not some tiny fishing shack. This was a real house. 2 stories, maybe 1,800 square feet with a stone chimney that looked solid enough to survive anything. The wraparound porch had thick log posts and a metal roof that had been painted forest green. I parked next to the front steps and sat in my car for a minute, engine off, just looking at the place. Everything was too clean. That was the first thing that bugged me. The porch was swept. The windows were spotless. No leaves piled up in corners. No cobwebs hanging from the eaves. The whole structure looked like someone had power washed it maybe a week ago. Even the gravel driveway was raked smooth, with neat edges where it met the grass. Porter had told me Clay lived in a nursing home for 3 years before he died. Said the old man couldn't take care of himself anymore. Couldn't drive. Could barely walk. But this place looked like someone had been maintaining it every single week. I got out and walked up the front steps. The wood didn't creak. The porch boards were solid, recently stained with no loose nails or warped planks. A pair of wooden rocking chairs sat at one end, positioned to face the lake. They had cushions. Clean cushions, like someone had brought them in from the rain and put them back out when the weather cleared. I tried the front door, expecting it to be locked. The handle turned easy. The inside hit me with that smell you get in houses where people actually live. Not musty or stale like I figured it would be. Coffee and wood soap and something that might have been bacon from breakfast. I stood in the doorway for maybe 30 seconds, just breathing it in and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The living room had furniture arranged like someone was coming back. A paperback book open face down on the coffee table, reading glasses next to it, a coffee mug on a coaster, still showing ring stains like it had been used recently. The fireplace had logs stacked neat beside it and kindling in a copper bucket. I walked through the main floor, checking each room. Kitchen, dining area, half bathroom, small office space. Everything clean. Everything organized. The kitchen really got to me. Dish towels hung straight on their hooks. Salt and pepper shakers lined up next to the stove. A calendar on the wall showed the current month, with a few dates circled in blue ink. But here's what made my skin crawl a little. I opened the refrigerator. Fresh groceries. A gallon of milk with an expiration date 2 weeks out. Eggs, lunch meat, a bag of apples that still had the grocery store sticker on it. Beer. Real butter, not the fake stuff. Condiments that hadn't expired. Even a carton of orange juice that was 3/4 full. Someone had gone grocery shopping for this place. Recently. I checked the freezer. Frozen vegetables, ground beef, a half-gallon of vanilla ice cream that was still soft when I touched the container. Not the kind of freezer burn you get when food sits for months. This was fresh stuff. Bought and stored like someone planned to eat it. The bathroom upstairs had soap in the dispenser and toilet paper on the holder. Clean towels folded on the rack, a medicine cabinet with basic stuff. Aspirin, antacid, bandages. Nothing prescription, but everything you'd need if you were living here. The bedroom was what really got to me. The bed was made. Not just covers pulled up, but actually made, with hospital corners and pillows arranged like someone had taken time to do it right. Fresh sheets that smelled like fabric softener. A glass of water on the nightstand that was maybe half empty. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to think through what I was seeing. Porter told me Clay had been in a nursing home for 3 years. Said the old man couldn't take care of himself. But this place looked like someone had been living here last week. Maybe yesterday. I checked the closets. Men's clothing in sizes that looked about right for someone my great-uncle's age. Shirts, pants, jackets, some work clothes, some casual stuff. Everything clean and hanging straight. Shoes lined up on the closet floor. Even underwear and socks folded in the dresser drawers. The office downstairs had papers scattered on the desk like someone had been working. Bills, mostly. Electric, propane, phone, all current, all paid. I found a checkbook in the top drawer with entries going back 6 months. Grocery store, gas station, hardware store. Someone had been writing checks and balancing the account every month. The handwriting looked shaky, like an old person's, but the amounts were accurate and the math was right. I spent maybe 2 hours going through everything, looking for some explanation. Found photo albums with pictures of people I didn't recognize. Fishing gear that looked used but well maintained. A tackle box with fresh bait and line that wasn't tangled. Books with bookmarks still in them. The whole place felt lived in. Not like someone had been maintaining an empty house, but like someone had been actually living here. Eating meals, sleeping in the bed, reading books by the fireplace, using the bathroom and washing dishes and doing all the normal things people do when they're home. But Porter said Clay was in a nursing home. Said he'd been there for 3 years, couldn't drive anymore, needed full-time care. So who'd been taking care of this place? By the time evening came around, I was sitting on the front porch in one of those rocking chairs, drinking a beer I'd found in the refrigerator and watching the sun set over that black lake. The water stayed dark, even with orange light reflecting off it. Like it was too deep to show the bottom. Or maybe there wasn't a bottom to show. I kept thinking about my mother's reaction when I'd called her about Clay. How scared she'd sounded. How she'd told me some things weren't worth what they cost. Maybe she knew about this place. Maybe she knew Clay hadn't been living in any nursing home. The feeling I got sitting there wasn't exactly comfortable. It was like being a guest in someone else's house, except the someone else was dead and had left me everything. The fresh groceries, the made bed, the clean towels. It all felt like someone had been preparing for my arrival. But who would do that? And how would they know I was coming? I finished the beer and went back inside, found some frozen pizza in the freezer and heated it up in the oven, ate it at the kitchen table while reading through more of Clay's papers, phone bills, electric bills, grocery receipts. Everything normal and current and paid on time. That's when I noticed something that made me stop chewing. The grocery receipts were all from the same store. Carlson's General Store, about 15 miles back toward the main highway. I remembered passing it on the drive up. Small place with gas pumps and a hand-painted sign. The receipts went back months, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. Always the same kind of stuff. Milk, bread, coffee, basic groceries. But here's what got me. The receipts were all signed. Not with a credit card, but actually signed, like someone was running a tab. The signature at the bottom was clear enough to read. Clay Lopez. Every single receipt, going back 6 months, signed with the same shaky handwriting I'd seen in the checkbook. I sat there staring at those receipts, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Either Clay Lopez hadn't been living in a nursing home, or someone else had been using his name to buy groceries and maintain his cabin. Either way, Porter had lied to me about something. The question was why. After going through the whole house twice, I figured I should check outside. I mean, the place was weird enough already with all that fresh food and clean laundry. Somebody was definitely living here, or had been until very recently. The grocery receipts proved that much. I walked around back first. The cabin sat on this little rise, and behind it the land sloped down toward the tree line. That's when I spotted it, this weird concrete structure built right into the hillside about 50 yards from the house. Just the front face was visible, like someone had dug into the hill and poured concrete for the entrance. The rest disappeared into the earth. I'd walked past it twice already, without really noticing. From the side, it looked like part of the natural slope, but head-on, you could see it was definitely man-made. A concrete wall, maybe 8 feet wide, with what looked like a steel door, set right in the middle. The door was painted this dull green color that had probably matched the forest better when it was new. Now it was faded and streaked with rust stains from the hinges. Heavy-duty thing, too. Like something you'd see on a walk-in freezer, but thicker. I walked closer. The concrete around the doorframe was rough, like it had been poured by hand instead of with proper forms. Amateur work, but solid enough. I knocked on the steel door just to see. Made this hollow thunk sound that echoed from inside. That's when I noticed the combination lock. It was one of those 4-digit master locks hanging from a hasp that had been welded to the doorframe. Nothing fancy. You could probably buy the same lock at any hardware store for $20. But it was keeping whatever was inside locked up tight. I grabbed the lock and gave it a shake. Felt solid. No rust on the mechanism either. This wasn't some old forgotten thing that had been hanging there for years. The metal was still bright where your fingers would touch it. I was about to give up and head back to the house when I saw the scratches in the concrete. Right next to the door frame, maybe 18 inches up from the ground. Someone had carved numbers into the concrete while it was still wet. 031584. The scratches were deep, like whoever made them really wanted to make sure they'd last, and they were positioned right where you'd see them if you were crouched down working on the lock. I stood there looking at those numbers for probably a full minute. Part of me was thinking this was stupid. What were the odds that some random numbers carved into concrete would actually open the lock? But another part was thinking about everything else I'd found. The fresh groceries, the made bed, the recent grocery receipts. Nothing about this place made sense anyway. I crouched down and spun the lock to 0. Then I started entering the numbers. 0, 3, 1, 5, 8, 4. The lock clicked open on the first try. That part bugged me a little, honestly. I mean, who carves the combination to their secret bunker right next to the door? Either Clay was getting forgetful in his old age, or he wanted someone to find this thing. Neither option made me feel great about what might be inside. I pulled the lock off and set it on the ground. The hasp swung free, and I grabbed the door handle. It was one of those industrial lever handles, painted the same green as the door. When I pushed down, the door moved easy. No squeaking hinges or resistance. Somebody'd been maintaining this thing. The door swung inward, and I got hit with this smell. Not bad, exactly, but sharp. Chemical. Like a doctor's office, but stronger. Antiseptic, mixed with something else I couldn't place. Inside was dark. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and showed me a room about 12 feet wide and maybe 20 feet deep. Concrete walls and ceiling. Concrete floor. No windows, obviously. But there was a light switch right inside the door. I flipped it, and fluorescent bulbs flickered on overhead. 2 long tubes that buzzed a little but gave off plenty of light. The place looked like a combination workshop and laboratory. Metal shelving units lined both walls, floor to ceiling, and every shelf was packed with mason jars. I'm talking dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all the same size. The quart jars you'd use for canning vegetables, but these weren't holding pickles or green beans. Each jar was filled with clear liquid, and floating in that liquid was tissue, preserved tissue samples from the look of it. Some jars held what looked like small organs. Others had chunks of muscle or skin. A few contained what might have been bone fragments. Every jar had a white label on the front with numbers written in black ink. Not random numbers, either. They were organized, sequential, like someone was keeping careful track of a collection. I walked down the narrow aisle between the shelving units, looking at the jars. The tissue samples were all different colors and textures. Some pink, some gray, some almost translucent. The preservative liquid was crystal clear in all of them, like it had been changed recently. At the far end of the room sat a metal desk, one of those gray steel things you'd find in an office building, but this one was set up like a workstation. There was a microscope, some kind of scale, measuring tools, and what looked like surgical instruments laid out on a towel. And there was a logbook, thick black binder, maybe 3 inches wide. It sat open on the desk like someone had been using it recently. I could see handwriting on the exposed pages. Very neat, very precise handwriting in blue ink. I sat down in the metal chair behind the desk and pulled the logbook closer. The pages were filled with entries, all in that same careful handwriting. Each entry had a date, a location, and several lines of what looked like clinical observations. The dates went back 40 years. I started reading from the beginning. The first entry was dated March 15, 1984. The location was listed as Subject 1, Initial Contact. Below that, someone had written detailed notes about tissue extraction procedures, preservation methods, and something called cellular analysis. The writing was clinical, cold, like reading a medical textbook, but worse, because these weren't theoretical examples. These were records of actual procedures performed on actual subjects. I flipped through more pages, hundreds of entries spanning 4 decades. The locations changed. Sometimes it was just Subject 2 or Subject 3, but other entries listed specific places. Towns I'd never heard of, rural locations, remote areas. The clinical observations got more detailed as the years went on. Notes about tissue compatibility, cellular regeneration rates, immune system responses. Technical language that went over my head, but the general idea was pretty clear. Clay had been collecting biological samples from people for 40 years, and he'd been keeping meticulous records of everything he did. I kept reading. The entries from the 1990s included sketches, crude drawings of incision sites, tissue removal techniques, Preservation protocols. The handwriting stayed consistent throughout, even as it got a little shakier in the recent entries. One entry from 2019 caught my attention. The location was listed as Madison General Emergency Department. The notes described obtaining samples during what looked like routine medical procedures. But the language suggested these weren't authorized samples. These were taken without anyone knowing. Another entry from last year mentioned enhanced preservation protocols and improved cellular viability. Technical stuff that made it sound like Clay was getting better at whatever he was doing. The most recent entry was dated 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. That was after Clay was supposed to have died, according to Porter. But here was an entry in his handwriting describing fresh tissue samples and new preservation techniques. I sat back in the chair and looked around the bunker again. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The mason jars lined the walls like some kind of horrible library. The chemical smell seemed stronger now, or maybe I was just noticing it more. This wasn't just weird. This was seriously messed up. Clay hadn't been running some kind of normal medical practice. This was something else entirely, something secret and probably illegal. The tissue samples, the clinical documentation, the 40-year timeline, it all pointed to one conclusion. Clay had been conducting unauthorized medical experiments on people, taking tissue samples without consent, maybe worse. And he'd been doing it from this remote location where nobody would think to look. The cabin was just cover. This bunker was his real workspace. I flipped to the back of the logbook, looking for more recent entries. The last few pages contained what looked like contact information. Names and addresses, phone numbers, medical facility schedules. Like Clay was keeping track of potential targets. Some of the names had check marks next to them. Others were crossed out entirely. My hands were shaking a little as I closed the logbook. This was way beyond anything I'd expected to find. I'd come here thinking I might learn something about a great uncle I'd never met. Instead, I'd stumbled into what looked like evidence of decades of medical crimes. The worst part was how organized everything was. This wasn't the work of someone who'd lost his mind. Clay had been methodical, careful, precise. He'd built this place specifically for what he was doing. He'd maintained it for 40 years, and based on those recent entries, he might still be doing it. I stood up from the desk and looked at the shelving units again. All those jars, all those tissue samples, each one representing someone who'd probably never known what happened to them. What the hell had Clay Lopez been doing out here all these years, and why had he left all of this to me? I didn't sleep much that night. Kept thinking about those jars and that logbook, the dates, the careful handwriting, the fact that someone had been down there 3 weeks ago, after Clay was supposed to be dead. Around 6 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and made coffee with Clay's machine. Still felt weird using his stuff, but I figured if he left me the place, he probably expected me to use it. The coffee was good. Better than the instant I usually made at home. I sat at his kitchen table with the grocery receipts spread out again. Carlson's General Store. Every signature said Clay Lopez in that same shaky handwriting. The most recent one was dated 2 weeks ago. Milk, bread, eggs, bacon. Normal stuff. Like someone was just living here, buying groceries, going about their business. But Clay was dead. Porter had been clear about that. So either Porter was lying, or someone else had been using Clay's name. Either way, I needed answers, and sitting in this cabin wasn't going to give me any. I looked up Carlson's General Store on my phone. 23 miles south, in a town called Raymond. Population 812, according to Wikipedia. One of those places with a main street and not much else. I figured that was as good a place to start as any. The drive took me 45 minutes on winding county roads, pine trees the whole way, broken up by the occasional farm or trailer. Not much traffic. A few pickup trucks, a school bus heading the opposite direction. The kind of roads where you wave at other drivers just because you see them. Raymond looked exactly like I'd expected. Main street with maybe 10 buildings, a few houses scattered around, most of them old. White church with a tall steeple, post office that probably doubled as something else, and right there in the middle, a building with Carlson's General Store painted in faded red letters across the front. I parked next to a rusted Ford pickup and walked inside. Bell jingled when I opened the door. That kind of place. The woman behind the counter was probably 70, maybe older. Gray hair curled tight, floral dress, the kind of face that smiled a lot. She looked up from sorting mail and smiled at me too. "Morning," she said. "Help you find something?" "I hope so." I walked over to the counter. "I'm looking for information about Clay Lopez." Her smile didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Clay Lopez?" "Yeah, he left me his cabin. I'm his great-nephew." That's when her whole face changed. Not scared, exactly, but careful, like she was suddenly paying attention in a different way. "You're Oliver," she said. I stopped walking. "How'd you know that?" "Clay talked about you sometimes." She set down the mail and really looked at me. "I'm Courtney Carlson. This is my store." "He talked about me?" "Oh yes, quite a bit actually." She came around the counter, moving slow but steady. "Said you worked hard, said you were a good boy who deserved better than what you had." That hit me weird. I'd never met Clay, far as I knew. But he'd been watching me somehow, keeping track, talking about me to this woman in a town I'd never heard of. "What else did he say?" Courtney glanced toward the front window, then back at me. "Clay was a good man, helped a lot of people around here." "Helped them how?" "Oh, you know, fixed things, gave advice." She waved her hand like it wasn't important, always willing to lend a hand when someone needed it. But she was being careful again, picking her words. "Mrs. Carlson, I found some things at his place. Things that don't make sense." "What kind of things?" I watched her face. "Medical equipment, records, like he was doing some kind of research." Her expression didn't change at all, which was weird because most people would have asked what kind of medical equipment or looked surprised or something. She just nodded like I'd told her the weather. "Clay was always interested in helping people," she said. "This was more than helping people. This was... Would you like some coffee?" She turned toward a pot sitting on a hot plate. "I just made it fresh." Classic redirect. My mom did the same thing when she didn't want to talk about something. Change the subject, offer food or drinks, hope the other person drops it. "Mrs. Carlson, did Clay ever mention what he was doing in that bunker behind his house?" She froze with the coffee pot halfway to a cup, just for a second. Then she finished pouring and turned back to me. "Clay kept to himself, mostly. Private man." "But you just said he helped people." "Well, yes, when they needed it." She handed me the coffee. "Sugar?" I took the cup, but didn't drink it. Someone's been buying groceries here under Clay's name, recent receipts, but Clay's supposed to be dead. Courtney sat down on a stool behind the counter, suddenly looked older. "That's probably just paperwork confusion," she said. "You know how these things get mixed up." "Mrs. Carlson." I set the coffee down. "I need to know what Clay was really doing. And I need to know who's been living in his house." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she glanced toward the window again. "Some things are better left alone, Oliver." "Why?" "Because some questions don't have good answers. Try me." She shook her head. "Clay wouldn't want you getting mixed up in his business. He was very clear about that." "When was he clear about that?" Another pause. "Before he passed." "Mrs. Carlson, when exactly did Clay die?" "I think you should talk to the sheriff," she said quickly. "Chase Mason. He'll be able to help you better than I can." And just like that, she was done talking. Started sorting mail again, humming under her breath like I wasn't even there. I finished the coffee, it was good, and left my phone number on a piece of paper, in case you remember anything else. She nodded without looking up. You take care, Oliver. The sheriff's station was 3 blocks away. Couldn't really miss it in a town that size. Single-story brick building with 2 parking spaces and a flagpole. Sign out front said Dane County Sheriff's Office, Raymond Substation. Inside was just 1 desk, 1 chair, and a man in a tan uniform typing something on an old computer. He looked up when I walked in. Help you? I hope so. I'm Oliver Lopez. I inherited Clay Lopez's cabin. The typing stopped. You're Oliver. Same thing Courtney had said, like they'd all been expecting me. I'm Chase Mason. He stood up and shook my hand. Firm grip, looked me right in the eye. Deputy Sheriff, sorry for your loss. Thanks, though I never actually met him. Yeah, Clay mentioned that. Mason sat back down, gestured to a folding chair across from his desk. What can I do for you? I sat down and gave him the same story I'd given Courtney, the inheritance, the cabin, the things I'd found. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. Clay was well respected around here, he said when I finished. Did a lot of good for people. What kind of good? Medical advice mostly. People around here don't always have easy access to doctors. Clay had some training, helped out when he could. What kind of training? Mason shifted in his chair. Look, Oliver, I know this is all confusing. Inheriting property from someone you never met, finding his personal belongings. But my advice would be to leave everything as you found it and think about selling the place. Why? Because it's a lot of responsibility. Remote property like that. And Clay's affairs were complicated. Complicated how? Just complicated. Mason leaned forward. Trust me, you'd be better off letting someone else deal with it. I can put you in touch with a good realtor. I stared at him. Deputy Mason, I found a concrete bunker behind Clay's house, full of medical equipment and preserved tissue samples, along with 40 years of detailed records. Mason's whole face went hard, like someone had flipped a switch. Where exactly did you find this bunker? Built into the hillside, about 50 yards behind the cabin. And you went inside? Yeah. The lock was... You shouldn't have done that. His voice was different now, colder. Clay's property contains hazardous materials. That area should be sealed off. Hazardous how? Medical waste, chemicals, things that require proper disposal. He stood up. I'm going to need you to stay away from that structure until we can get a cleanup crew out there. Deputy Mason, those weren't hazardous materials. Those were specimens, cataloged, preserved, documented. Someone was conducting research. Mr. Lopez. He was using his cop voice now. I'm telling you to stay away from that bunker, for your own safety. I stood up too. What was Clay really doing? Clay Lopez was a respected member of this community who helped people when they needed medical attention. That's all you need to know. And the tissue samples? Medical waste from his volunteer work, nothing more. But his eyes were saying something different, and the way he'd reacted when I mentioned the bunker, that wasn't surprise. That was recognition. Someone's been living in that house recently, I said. Fresh food in the fridge, recent grocery receipts. But Clay's supposed to be dead. Mason walked to the door and held it open. Mr. Lopez, I strongly advise you to leave Clay's belongings undisturbed and consider selling the property as soon as possible. There are liability issues you probably don't want to deal with. What kind of liability issues? The kind that require lawyers. I walked to the door but didn't leave. Deputy Mason, how well did you know my uncle? Well enough. Well enough to know what he was really doing in that bunker. Mason's jaw tightened. Mr. Lopez, this conversation is over. Stay away from that structure. I won't tell you again. I left, but I sat in my car outside the station for 10 minutes, thinking. Mason knew exactly what was in that bunker, had probably known for years, and instead of investigating it, he was trying to get me to leave it alone. Same thing Courtney had done. Different approach. Same goal. Get Oliver out of town. Sell the property. Let sleeping dogs lie. But why? If Clay was just some old guy who helped people with medical advice, why all the secrecy? Why the evasive answers? Why did everyone act like they knew something they couldn't talk about? I started the car and drove back toward the cabin, thinking about those tissue samples, the precise documentation. 40 years of entries in that logbook, and the most recent entry dated 3 weeks ago, after Clay was supposedly dead. Someone in Raymond knew exactly what Clay had been doing, and they all wanted it to stay buried. That evening I went back to the bunker. Couldn't help myself, really. All that stuff Mason said about hazardous waste and cleanup crews, that was bullshit. I knew it. He knew I knew it. But I had to see what was really down there. I waited until after dark to be safe. Not that anyone was around to see me, but the whole conversation in town left me feeling watched. Paranoid, probably, but still. The concrete door was heavier than I remembered. Had to put my shoulder into it. The fluorescent lights flickered for a few seconds before they caught, casting that harsh white glow over everything. The chemical smell hit me again, stronger this time, or maybe I was just paying more attention. It wasn't just antiseptic. There was something else underneath. Something organic. I started with the jars. Yesterday I'd just glanced at them, trying to process what I was seeing. Tonight I looked closer. Way closer than I wanted to. The labels were more detailed than I'd noticed. Not just numbers. Each one had a date, a procedure code, and what looked like patient initials. The earliest jars were from March of '84. Cloudy glass, yellowed liquid. The tissue inside was dark, unrecognizable. But the newer ones, Jesus, the newer ones were crystal clear. I picked up a jar from last year. The label read 1123 FG ALT RM. The tissue inside was pale pink, perfectly preserved. Skin, maybe, or muscle. I held it up to the light and could see the grain of it, the texture. It looked fresh, like it had been cut yesterday. That's when it hit me. These weren't animal samples. They were way too big, too complex. The piece in my hand was maybe 3 inches long, 2 inches wide, curved like it came from somewhere specific, somewhere human. I set the jar down real careful. My hands were shaking a little. I'd suspected it yesterday, but seeing it up close like that, knowing for sure, that was different. There had to be 200 jars on those shelves. Maybe more. 40 years of collecting, 40 years of cutting pieces out of people and preserving them in mason jars like my grandmother's green beans. I needed to sit down. The logbook was still open on the desk where I'd left it. I flipped back to the beginning, to that first entry from March 15th, 1984. The handwriting was different back then. Steadier. Younger. Initial consultation. Gunshot wound. Abdomen. Patient refused hospital treatment. Bullet removed successfully. Wound irrigated and sutured. No complications. Tissue sample preserved for reference. That was it. Just a few lines. Clinical, professional, like something you'd read in a real medical chart. The next entry was from April. Another gunshot wound, this one in the shoulder. Same format, same professional tone. But at the bottom, a note. Patient paid in cash, no questions asked. I kept reading. May, June, July. All gunshot wounds or knife injuries. All cash payments. All with that little note about no questions. By August, the entries were getting longer, more detailed about the procedures. And the tissue samples. Every single one included a tissue sample. That's when I figured it out. Clay wasn't just some backwoods doctor helping hunters with accidents. He was treating people who couldn't go to hospitals, people who had reasons to avoid official medical records. The picture got clearer as I read through the 80s. Clay had been a veterinarian, licensed, legitimate, but somewhere along the way, he'd started supplementing his income with off-the-books human medicine. treating gunshot wounds for people who couldn't afford questions, patching up knife fights, fixing broken bones that happened in places they shouldn't have happened. By 1987, the entries were different. Longer procedures, more complex surgeries, and a new phrase that showed up again and again: identity modification requested. I had to read that entry 3 times before I understood what it meant. Patient requested removal of distinguishing marks. Birthmark on left shoulder, excised completely. Scar tissue from previous injury revised to appear accidental. Fingerprint alteration. Acid treatment to tips of right hand, first 3 fingers. Patient tolerated procedure well. Full payment received. My stomach dropped. Clay wasn't just treating injuries anymore. He was helping people change who they were, physically changing them so they couldn't be identified. The nausea started building as I kept reading. 1988 brought facial reconstruction. Cheekbone reduction to alter profile. Nose reshaping to eliminate distinctive features. Surgical removal of identifying scars. By the 90s, Clay had become an expert at making people disappear, not killing them, transforming them. The logbook entries read like a how-to manual for erasing someone's physical identity. Fingerprint removal using acid and surgical techniques. Facial bone restructuring. Dental work to eliminate bite patterns. I had to stop reading for a minute. The fluorescent light was buzzing, that annoying electrical hum that gets under your skin. The air felt thick, stale. I realized I'd been holding my breath. The tissue samples made sense now. Clay had been keeping trophies, or maybe evidence. Every procedure documented, every piece of removed tissue preserved and cataloged. 40 years of helping people become someone else. But what kind of people need that level of identity change? You don't go through surgical facial reconstruction and fingerprint removal because you want a fresh start after a bad divorce. You do it because you're running from something serious, something that'll kill you if it finds you. I picked up the logbook again, forced myself to keep reading. The 2000s brought even more sophisticated procedures. Clay had gotten better at his craft. The descriptions were more detailed, the techniques more refined. Full facial reconstruction to eliminate all identifying characteristics. Patient provided reference photos for desired appearance. Complete success achieved. Reference photos. Clay wasn't just removing identifying features anymore. He was rebuilding people to look like someone specific. Maybe someone who was already dead. Maybe someone who never existed. I flipped ahead to the more recent entries. 2010. Facial trauma repair with identity modification. Patient had extensive damage from blunt force. Used reconstruction as opportunity for complete facial redesign per patient specifications. The clinical language couldn't hide what was really happening. Someone had beaten the hell out of this person's face, and Clay had used the necessary reconstruction to give them a completely new identity. 2 birds, 1 stone. 2015. Emergency procedure, multiple gunshot wounds, facial area. Patient requested complete reconstruction rather than traditional repair. Identity elimination priority over aesthetic outcome. I set the book down. My hands were shaking again. Worse this time. The picture was getting too clear. Clay hadn't just been helping people hide from the law. He'd been helping them hide from people who wanted them dead. People who'd already tried to kill them. The tissue samples weren't trophies. They were insurance. Proof of what he'd done, maybe. Or leverage. Evidence that could destroy his patients' new identities if they ever crossed him. I looked around the bunker again. Really looked, this time. The metal shelving wasn't just storage. It was organized like a filing system. The jars were arranged chronologically, labeled systematically. This wasn't the workspace of some backwoods doctor helping hunters. This was a professional operation. Clay had been running an underground identity clinic for 40 years, taking money from people desperate enough to let someone cut their faces apart and rebuild them as strangers. People running from organized crime, maybe. Witnesses who needed to disappear. Criminals who'd burned their bridges and needed to become ghosts. The kind of people who'd pay any amount of money to stop being who they were. I thought about what Courtney had said. Clay helped people, fixed things, gave advice. She hadn't been lying exactly, just not telling the whole truth. Clay did help people, people who needed to stop existing. And Mason, his reaction when I mentioned the bunker. He'd known exactly what was in here, probably knew for years, which meant either Clay had been paying him to look the other way, or Mason was getting a cut of the business. The most recent entry was still bothering me. 3 weeks after Clay's supposed death. Someone had been down here, making notes in that logbook. Someone who knew the combination to the lock, knew how to work Clay's equipment, knew enough about the procedures to continue the documentation. I flipped to the back of the logbook again. Those contact lists I'd seen yesterday. Names, phone numbers, addresses. Some checked off, others crossed out. I studied them closer this time. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but there were patterns. Medical facilities in Madison, Milwaukee, Chicago, emergency departments, trauma centers, morgues, and next to each one, notes about schedules, shift changes, security procedures. Clay hadn't been working alone. He'd had contacts inside legitimate medical facilities, people who could provide him with supplies, information, maybe even fresh tissue samples for his research. The crossed-out names bothered me most. What happened to those people? Did they get caught? Did they refuse to help anymore? Or did they become problems that needed solving? I closed the logbook and stood up. The fluorescent light buzzed louder, or maybe I was just noticing it more. The chemical smell seemed stronger too, like it was seeping into my clothes, my skin. 40 years of this. 40 years of taking desperate people and turning them into ghosts. Clay had built himself a business based on other people's terror. People scared enough to let him carve away everything that made them recognizable. And now I owned it. All of it. The cabin, the bunker, the jars, the logbook. Clay's entire operation passed down to me like some twisted inheritance. I thought about my mother's reaction when I'd called her. The fear in her voice. The way she'd told me not to pursue it, that some things weren't worth what they cost. She'd known. Maybe not the details, but she'd known Clay wasn't just some eccentric uncle who lived in the woods. She'd known he was dangerous. I kept looking at those jars, thinking Mason was full of shit about hazardous waste. The whole setup was too organized, too careful. Clay wasn't some amateur collecting random samples. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. The shelving unit on the left wall. It wasn't sitting flush against the concrete. There was maybe a 1/4-inch gap where it should have been tight. I walked over and pushed on it. The whole thing moved. Took me a minute to figure out it was on hinges. The metal frame pivoted outward like a door, and behind it was another section of concrete wall with a rectangular cutout. A hidden compartment, about 3 feet wide, 2 feet tall, built right into the wall itself. Inside were manila file folders. Dozens of them, stacked neat and organized with typed labels on the tabs. I pulled out the first one and opened it on Clay's desk. Photographs, before and after shots. The kind you'd see at a plastic surgeon's office, except these weren't cosmetic procedures. The first photo showed a man's face that looked like it had gone through a meat grinder. Broken nose, split lip, orbital fractures around both eyes. His whole left cheek was caved in. The after photo showed the same man. I could tell by the ears and the shape of his skull, but his face was completely different. New nose, different chin, even the spacing between his eyes looked changed. I flipped through more photos. Same pattern. Men with severe trauma, then the same men with new faces. Not just repaired faces, totally different faces. The photos weren't random either. Each set was stapled to documents, driver's licenses, social security cards, birth certificates, all showing the same person with different names. I found one file that made my stomach drop. A guy named Marcus Chen, according to his original ID. The before photos showed him with a bullet wound through his jaw. The after photos showed a completely different person. White guy instead of Asian. The new driver's license said Robert Williams. Same height, same weight, but everything else was different. Even his eye color had changed from brown to blue. Contact lenses, I figured, or maybe surgical implants. I didn't know enough about it to be sure. I kept going through the files. Each one was the same pattern: severe facial trauma, complete reconstruction, new identity. The dates went back decades. Some of the earliest photos were Polaroids, faded in yellow. The newer ones were digital prints. What got me was how thorough it all was. Clay hadn't just changed their faces. He'd given them complete new lives. Social security numbers that looked real. Birth certificates with official seals. Driver's licenses from different states. I pulled out another file. This one was different. No trauma photos. Just before and after shots of a man who looked perfectly healthy. The before showed a thin guy with a sharp nose and receding hairline. The after showed someone who looked like his brother, but heavier, with a different nose and a full head of hair. The paperwork showed his original name as David Kowalski. His new identity was James Murphy, but clipped to the back of the folder was something that made my hands shake. A newspaper clipping. Chicago Tribune. Local businessman missing after embezzlement charges filed. The photo showed David Kowalski. The article said he'd stolen $2.3 million from his construction company and disappeared before his arrest warrant was served. That's when I understood what I was really looking at. I went back to the other files, reading more carefully this time. Marcus Chen, I found another newspaper clipping about him. Gang shooting in Milwaukee. He was wanted for killing 2 people outside a bar. Robert Williams didn't exist before the date on his driver's license. Every file had them: missing person reports, wanted posters, newspaper articles about murders, robberies, fraud cases. All clipped from papers across the Midwest. Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, going back 40 years. I sat there with the files spread across Clay's desk, feeling sick to my stomach. This wasn't just an identity clinic for people who needed to disappear. It was a service for criminals, murderers, thieves, guys running from serious charges. Clay had been helping them vanish completely. The tissue samples weren't documentation of medical procedures. They were insurance. Proof that he could identify his clients if he needed to, or if someone else needed to. I thought about Mason's reaction when I mentioned the bunker. He wasn't worried about hazardous waste. He was worried about exposure, about someone finding out what Clay had really been doing for 4 decades, and Courtney at the store. When she said Clay helped people, she knew exactly what kind of help he provided. The whole town probably knew. Clay Lopez, the guy who could give you a new face and a new life if you had enough cash and were desperate enough to need it. I kept reading the newspaper clippings. Some of them were recent. A guy named Anthony Ricci, wanted for 3 murders in Chicago. Last seen 6 months ago. His file showed new ID as Thomas Anderson, with a Wisconsin address I didn't recognize. Another one from last year. Jessica Martinez, wanted for killing her husband and stealing his life insurance money. Her after photos showed a blonde woman who looked nothing like the dark-haired woman in the mugshot. New name was Sarah Peterson. The most recent file was dated 2 weeks ago. A man named Vincent Torres, wanted in connection with a triple homicide in Detroit. His before photos showed someone with distinctive facial scars and a broken nose. The after photos showed those scars were gone. The nose was fixed, and he looked like a completely different person. 2 weeks ago. After Clay was supposed to be dead. I closed the file and sat back in Clay's chair. My hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from understanding what I'd inherited. Clay hadn't just left me a cabin and 40 acres of forest. He'd left me a business, a criminal enterprise that had been operating for 4 decades, and someone was still running it. That explained the fresh groceries, the clean house, the recent logbook entries. Clay might be dead, but his operation wasn't. Someone had taken over. Someone who knew the combination to the bunker, knew how to use the equipment, knew how to document the procedures. I thought about my mother's reaction when I told her about the inheritance. Her fear wasn't about some distant family secret. She knew what Clay did. She knew exactly what kind of business he ran. The townspeople weren't being evasive to protect Clay's reputation, they were protecting themselves. If word got out about what had been happening in Raymond, if the FBI started investigating, everyone who'd kept quiet for 40 years would be in trouble. I understood now why Mason had tried so hard to get me to leave, why Courtney had deflected every question, why both of them knew my name before I introduced myself. Clay had been talking about me, probably planning to bring me into the business. Maybe that's why he left everything to me. The idea made me sick. I'd never met the man, but somehow he'd decided I was the right person to inherit his criminal operation. Maybe he thought I was desperate enough to take over, or maybe he just needed someone to dispose of the evidence. I started putting the files back in the hidden compartment, but I couldn't stop thinking about all those newspaper clippings. Dozens of unsolved cases, murderers walking around with new faces, new names, new lives. All because my great-uncle had the skills and the lack of conscience to help them disappear. The worst part was how good he'd been at it. The new identities looked completely legitimate. The facial reconstruction work was professional quality. He'd probably saved some of these people from life in prison or the death penalty. I closed the hidden compartment and pushed the shelving unit back into place. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and that chemical smell seemed stronger than before, like it was getting into my clothes, my skin. I picked up the logbook one more time, flipping to that final entry from 3 weeks ago. Whoever wrote it knew exactly how to format the documentation, how to catalog the tissue samples, how to record the procedure details. They weren't learning on the job. They'd been trained. Maybe Clay had an apprentice. Someone he'd been teaching the business to before he died. Someone who was ready to take over when the time came. I thought about the crossed-out names in the contact lists at the back of the logbook. Former associates who'd probably gotten too old, too unreliable, or too dangerous to keep around. Clay's business required absolute secrecy. Anyone who might talk would be a liability. Standing there in that concrete room, surrounded by 40 years of evidence, I finally understood what I'd walked into. This wasn't just about inheriting property. It was about inheriting responsibility for keeping quiet about what Clay had done, about protecting the people who'd helped him, about deciding what to do with an operation that was still running. I turned off the lights and headed for the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that whoever had taken over Clay's business knew I was here, knew what I'd found, and was trying to figure out what I planned to do about it. The lock clicked back into place, but I knew I'd be coming back. I had too many questions, and the answers were all in that bunker, along with enough evidence to put dozens of people in prison for the rest of their lives, including, probably me. I woke up to knocking on the front door at 7:30. Not gentle knocking either, the kind that says, "I know you're in there." I'd been sleeping on Clay's couch because the bed upstairs felt too weird, like wearing a dead guy's clothes. The couch was bad enough, but at least I could pretend I was just visiting. The knocking came again. 3 sharp raps. I figured it was probably Courtney with more coffee and deflection tactics. Or maybe some other Raymond local who wanted to check out Clay's mysterious great-nephew. I pulled on my jeans and opened the door. Mason stood on the porch in full uniform, badge, gun, the whole deal. His squad car was parked next to my Honda. "Morning, Oliver." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." That was it. No pleasantries, no how'd you sleep. Just walked right into Clay's living room and sat down in the leather chair like he owned it. I stayed by the door. About what? About why I was being an asshole yesterday. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much either. And about what you really inherited. I figured this was going to be another round of the same bullshit. More warnings about hazardous waste and liability, but Mason's voice was different today, flatter, like he was done pretending. "Clay Lopez was under FBI investigation for 8 years, he said. Never had enough evidence to move on him. But they knew. I closed the door and walked over to the couch. Knew what? that he was running the most successful criminal identity service in the Midwest. There it was. No more medical waste stories. No more volunteer work explanations. Just the truth, laid out plain. Mason leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "You want some coffee? This is going to take a while." I went to the kitchen and started Clay's coffee maker. My hands were steadier than I expected. Maybe because part of me had been waiting for this conversation since I opened that bunker door. "How long have you known?" I called from the kitchen. "About Clay, officially? Never. Unofficially. 12 years. The coffee maker gurgled. I found 2 mugs in the cabinet, same ones Clay had been drinking from a week ago, probably. "FBI came through Raymond in 2012, Mason said. Asking questions about Clay. Wanted to know about his medical background, his clients, his finances. Real casual like. I brought the coffee out. Mason took his black. "They told me Clay was a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. Something about identity fraud and fugitive assistance. Asked me to keep an eye on him. But you didn't report anything." Mason looked at me over his coffee mug. "Report what? That Clay fixed up people who couldn't go to hospitals? That he kept to himself and minded his own business?" I sat down on the couch. "That's not what he was doing, and you know it." "No." Mason set down his mug. "It's not." He was quiet for a minute. I could hear the coffee maker finishing up in the kitchen, birds singing outside, normal morning sounds that didn't match the conversation. "You know how many people vanish every year in this country?" Mason asked. "Just disappear completely?" I didn't. Thousands. Most of them are runaways or people starting over. But some of them are different. Some of them are wanted for serious crimes. Murder, assault, organized crime connections. People who have every reason to disappear and the money to make it happen. Mason pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. Looked like a printout from some database. "In the last 15 years, at least 30 known criminals have vanished from police custody or jumped bail and were never found again. All of them had connections to the Chicago, Milwaukee, or Minneapolis areas. All of them disappeared within 6 months of serious charges being filed." He handed me the paper. Names, dates, charges. I recognized a couple from the files I'd seen in Clay's bunker. "Marcus Chen," I said, pointing to the list. "He was in Clay's files." Chen killed 2 people in a gang shooting in Chicago, posted bail and vanished 3 days before trial. That was 15 years ago. Never been seen since. I kept reading. David Kowalski, wanted for embezzlement. Vincent Torres, triple homicide. Names that matched the files hidden behind Clay's shelving unit. "The FBI thinks these people are dead," Mason said. "Killed by their own organizations to keep them quiet, or murdered by rivals. The alternative doesn't occur to them. That they're walking around with new faces." "Exactly." Mason took the paper back and folded it carefully. "Clay didn't just treat gunshot wounds for people who couldn't go to hospitals. He provided complete identity reconstruction for anyone willing to pay his fee." "Which was what?" $200,000. Cash only, half up front, half after recovery. I thought about the grocery receipts, all those small purchases. Clay living quietly in a cabin, driving an old truck, shopping at Carlson's for basic supplies. He wasn't spending the money he was making. "Where's the money now?" I asked. Mason smiled, not a happy smile. "That's a very good question." He stood up and walked to the window. Looked out at the lake for a minute. "Your mother dated one of Clay's early clients," he said without turning around. That hit me like cold water. "What?" 1991. Guy named Thomas Brennan. Clay had just finished reconstructing his face after a warehouse fire in Milwaukee. Changed his nose, his jawline, his eye shape. Gave him the name Michael Torres. My mother would have been 19 in '91, just out of high school. She was working at a diner in Madison. Michael Torres came in every day for 3 months. Charming guy, according to what Clay wrote in his files. Good tipper, asked her out eventually. Mason turned away from the window. She had no idea who he really was. I set down my coffee. My hands weren't steady anymore. Thomas Brennan was wanted for arson and murder. Burned down a warehouse with 6 people inside. Insurance fraud gone wrong. The bodies were so badly burned they couldn't be identified for weeks. How did my mother find out? Clay told her. That didn't make sense. Why would Clay do that? Mason sat back down. Because your mother was asking questions about Michael's scars, his medical history, why he paid for everything in cash. She was 19 and in love and starting to think about a future with this guy. I tried to picture my mother at 19, dating a murderer, having no idea. Clay showed up at the diner where she worked, told her exactly who Michael Torres really was, showed her newspaper clippings about the warehouse fire, photos of the victims. Jesus, your mother threatened to call the police, turn in both Clay and Michael Torres. Clay explained that wouldn't be a good idea for her health or longevity. Mason leaned back in his chair. So your mother moved to Kenosha, changed jobs, never saw Michael Torres again, and never said a word about Clay Lopez to anyone. Now I understood the fear in my mother's voice, the way she'd tried to talk me out of coming here. She knew exactly what Clay was capable of. She's been terrified for 30 years, I said. With good reason. Mason finished his coffee and set the mug on Clay's coffee table, right next to the book Clay had been reading when he died, or when someone wanted me to think he'd died. Which brings us to your choice, Mason said. I waited. You can turn over everything you found to the FBI. The files, the tissue samples, the logbook, all of it. They'll investigate, arrest people, probably find some of Clay's clients and put them back in prison. That sounds like the right thing to do. Maybe, but you should know what else will happen. Mason counted on his fingers. Your mother will be questioned extensively about her relationship with Michael Torres, her knowledge of Clay's activities, why she never reported what she knew. The media will find out about Clay's operation and your inheritance. Your life will become a circus for about 2 years. I hadn't thought about any of that. And, Mason continued, whoever took over Clay's business will know you're the one who exposed them. They have your name, your address, and access to some very dangerous people. What's the other choice? Destroy everything. Burn the files, dump the tissue samples, wipe down the bunker, and sell the property to a developer. Walk away clean. Mason stood up. Clay's been dead for 3 weeks. Whoever's running things now has already moved the operation somewhere else. The bunker's just evidence now. Liability. I looked around Clay's living room, at his books, his reading glasses, his coffee mug, at the life he'd built as cover for 40 years of helping murderers disappear. How do I know you're not involved? I asked. Mason nodded like he'd been expecting that question. You don't. But if I was involved, you'd already be dead. That was probably true. I've been watching this situation for 12 years, Mason said, waiting for Clay to make a mistake, or for the FBI to find real evidence. Now Clay's gone and the operation's moved on. This is your chance to walk away before it gets worse. He headed for the door. How much time do I have to decide? Mason stopped with his hand on the doorknob. Not much. Whoever's running things now knows you've been here. They know you've seen the bunker. They're probably watching this conversation. He looked back at me. Make your choice fast, Oliver. And whatever you decide, don't change your mind later. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Instead, I sat at Clay's kitchen table with every file folder spread across the surface like some kind of sick puzzle. The coffee maker gurgled through 3 pots while I matched newspaper clippings to before and after photos, connecting dots I wished I couldn't see. Marcus Chen became Robert Williams after shooting 2 kids outside a Chicago McDonald's in 2009. The Tribune article had their school photos. Jessica Martinez, 14, and her little brother Carlos, 12. They were walking home from soccer practice when Chen's drug deal went bad and he opened fire on the wrong car. Missed his target completely. Hit the kids instead. Chen's reconstruction file showed Clay had rebuilt his entire face. Different nose, different jaw, different everything. The tissue sample jar labeled 0309 MC Rec facial contained pieces of the original Marcus Chen. Robert Williams got a driver's license in Milwaukee 2 weeks after the shooting. Clean background check. New social security number. The kid's parents spent 15 years wondering if their children's killer was still out there. Turns out he was working at a Ford plant in Wisconsin the whole time. That was just one file. I had 63 more. David Kowalski embezzled $2.3 million from his construction company in Chicago, then became James Murphy after Clay shaved down his cheekbones and rebuilt his nose. The newspaper said Kowalski had 3 kids and a wife who lost their house when the money disappeared. His reconstruction photos showed Clay had made him look 10 years younger and 50 pounds lighter. Murphy got a job at a bank in Minneapolis, probably still there. Vincent Torres killed 3 people in Detroit, a grandmother, her daughter, and a 6-year-old grandson during a home invasion last month. Clay's logbook showed Torres paid cash for emergency reconstruction 2 weeks ago. Someone finished the job after Clay died. Torres was probably already living under a new name somewhere, maybe planning his next home invasion. I kept going through files until my hands shook from too much coffee and not enough food. Found missing persons reports stapled to surgical notes. Drug dealers who vanished before trial, then got new faces and clean identities. A woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus, who killed her 3 children in Milwaukee, then disappeared. Clay had given her blonde hair instead of black, blue eyes instead of brown, and a completely different bone structure. The tissue samples proved it, jar after jar of evidence that could identify people who'd been ghosts for decades. Around 4 in the morning, I found the worst one, a file for someone named Michael Ross, originally from Minneapolis. The newspaper clipping was from 1998. Ross had been running a child trafficking ring out of a daycare center. Kidnapped 8 kids between ages 4 and 7. Sold them to buyers across the country. Clay had reconstructed Ross's entire face and given him the identity Peter Walsh. The surgical photos showed work that would have taken months. Complete facial restructuring, dental work, even surgery to change his height by shortening his leg bones. Ross became Walsh in early 1999 and moved to Iowa, where he got a job at another daycare center. That one made me get up and walk around the house. I stood on the back porch looking toward the bunker, breathing cold air and trying not to think about how many families never found their missing children because Clay Lopez gave their kidnapper a new face. But I kept thinking about it anyway. Kept thinking about all of it. 63 files, 63 families who never got answers, parents who died wondering if their murdered kid's killer was still out there, children who grew up not knowing what happened to their missing siblings, wives who spent decades afraid their abusive husband might come back, not knowing he was living 3 states away under a different name. Clay had charged these people $200,000 each to disappear. $12.5 million over 40 years. All while families suffered and police departments kept open files on cases they'd never solve because the suspects had new faces. I sat back down at the table and kept reading. Had to. Someone needed to see this. Someone needed to know. By 6 in the morning, I'd been through every file twice, made notes on a legal pad I found in Clay's desk, cross-referenced missing persons reports with surgical dates. The pattern was clear. Clay had been helping murderers, kidnappers, and drug dealers vanish for 40 years while their victims' families lived in limbo. The sun was coming up when I finally made the call. Information gave me the number for the FBI field office in Milwaukee. I dialed at 7:15 when I figured someone might actually answer. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Milwaukee Field Office. I need to report a crime, I said. Multiple crimes. I have evidence. What type of evidence, sir? Medical records, surgical files, documentation of identity fraud and fugitive assistance spanning 40 years. The woman's voice changed, got more focused. Can you hold, please? I held, drank more coffee, looked at the files spread across Clay's table. This is Agent Jennifer Walsh. You said you have evidence of identity fraud? My name is Oliver Lopez. I inherited property from my great-uncle Clay Lopez in northern Wisconsin. Found a bunker behind his house with medical equipment and files documenting facial reconstruction surgery for wanted criminals. I have tissue samples, photographs, identity documents, and a complete logbook dating back to 1984. Silence for maybe 10 seconds. Mr. Lopez, we're going to need to see this evidence immediately. Can you provide the exact location? I gave her the address, told her about the bunker combination, the hidden files, everything. Agent Walsh said they'd have a team there within 2 hours and asked me to secure the scene until they arrived. I spent those 2 hours putting files back in order, made sure everything was exactly where I'd found it. Didn't want to mess up their investigation. The FBI showed up at 9:30, 3 black SUVs and a van full of equipment. Agent Walsh turned out to be a woman about 40 with short brown hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She had 2 other agents with her and a team of evidence technicians. I walked them to the bunker and opened it with Clay's combination. Watched Agent Walsh's face when she saw the jars of tissue samples lining both walls. Watched her examine the surgical equipment and flip through Clay's logbook. Jesus Christ, she said quietly. Then looked at me. You did the right thing calling us. I handed over everything. The logbook, the hidden files, Clay's house keys, even the grocery receipts from Carlson's store. Told them about Mason's visit and his warning to destroy the evidence. Told them about my mother's reaction when I mentioned Clay's name. Agent Walsh said they'd been tracking identity fraud cases in the Midwest for years without finding the source. Said Clay's operation explained dozens of cold cases across multiple states. The evidence team spent 6 hours documenting everything. Photographed every jar, every file, every page of the logbook. Loaded it all into their van like they were moving Clay's entire operation to Quantico. Agent Walsh told me they'd need my testimony for the prosecution, but that I wasn't in any legal trouble. Said the people who took over Clay's business would probably disappear once they heard about the FBI raid. She was right about that. Mason never came back to check on me. Nobody else showed up asking questions. The arrests started 3 weeks later. I saw them on the news. Federal raids across 7 states, dozens of people in custody. The FBI had used Clay's tissue samples for DNA identification and matched them to people living under false names. Marcus Chen was arrested at the Ford plant in Milwaukee. David Kowalski got picked up at his bank in Minneapolis. Sarah Chen was working as a school nurse in Iowa under the name Jennifer Walsh. Yeah, same last name as the FBI agent. Weird coincidence. The news said they'd identified 47 people using Clay's files. Some were already dead, some had committed new crimes under their false identities, but most were just living normal lives with stolen names. The families finally got their answers. I watched interviews with parents who'd spent decades wondering about missing children, finally learning what happened. Some of the families held memorial services, some pushed for longer sentences. All of them seemed relieved to finally know. The federal government bought Clay's property from me for $2 million. Said they needed it for evidence storage and ongoing prosecutions. I didn't argue. Didn't want the money either. But Agent Walsh said I'd earned it for doing the right thing. I used the money to move to Colorado. Found a job at a shipping company in Denver. Got a small house in the mountains. Started over completely. Changed my phone number. Didn't leave a forwarding address. Just disappeared. Not the way Clay's clients disappeared. I kept my own face and name. But I wanted distance from everything that happened in Wisconsin. Wanted to forget about jars full of human tissue and files documenting 40 years of evil. It took me 6 months to understand why my mother had been so afraid when I mentioned Clay's name. She'd known exactly what he was, had probably spent 30 years terrified that Thomas Brennan would come back looking for her, or that Clay would decide she knew too much and needed to disappear permanently. She'd spent 3 decades protecting me from a truth that could have gotten us both killed. Kept Clay's secrets to keep us safe, even though it meant lying to me my entire life. I called her from Colorado to tell her Clay was gone and the FBI had everything. Told her she didn't need to be afraid anymore. She cried for 20 minutes straight. Said she'd been carrying that fear for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to not have it. I never went back to Wisconsin. Never wanted to see that bunker or Clay's house again. Sometimes I wondered if the lake water was still black, if the fish-shaped mailbox was still standing, if anyone else knew about the dirt road through the pine trees. Mostly, I just tried to forget about it all. Built a normal life in Colorado, worked normal hours, came home to a normal house where the only thing in the basement was a washing machine. But sometimes I'd see a missing person report on the news and wonder if Clay had been involved. Wonder how many other operations like his were still running somewhere, helping monsters become ghosts while families waited for answers that might never come. I'd done what I could, given the FBI everything Clay had hidden, helped put 47 criminals back in prison where they belonged, gave dozens of families the closure they'd been waiting for. That had to be enough. Had to be worth something. I kept telling myself that anyway when the nightmares woke me up at 3 in the morning. The federal prosecutions took 2 years. Agent Walsh called me every few months with updates. Said they'd recovered over 40 missing children who were still alive, reunited families that had been separated for decades, closed cold cases dating back to the 80s. Said Clay's tissue samples had been the key to everything, DNA evidence that couldn't be faked or destroyed, proof that connected new identities to old crimes, faces to names, ghosts to the people they used to be. The trials made national news. Families testified about decades of not knowing. Prosecutors showed Clay's before and after photos to juries who couldn't believe someone could change a face that completely. Defense lawyers argued their clients had paid for legitimate medical procedures, but the tissue samples and newspaper clippings told a different story. Most of them got life sentences. Some got death. A few cooperated and got reduced time in exchange for information about other operations, other doctors, other places where people could buy new faces. I testified in 3 trials. Flew back to Wisconsin each time, stayed in a hotel near the courthouse, answered questions about finding the bunker and discovering the files. Defense attorneys tried to make me look like I'd tampered with evidence or misunderstood what I'd found, but Agent Walsh had done her job right. Every jar, every file, every page of Clay's logbook was documented exactly as I'd found it. After the last trial, I drove past Raymond on my way to the airport. Carlson's general store was boarded up. The sheriff's station looked empty. Most of the town seemed abandoned, like people had decided they didn't want to live in the place where Clay Lopez had operated for 40 years. I never found out what happened to Mason. Agent Walsh said he'd resigned from the sheriff's department and moved away before they could question him. Probably figured he was better off disappearing than explaining why he'd known about Clay's operation and never reported it. The lake house sold to the government for evidence storage, but I heard they demolished it after the trials ended. Probably filled in the bunker, too. Nothing left but an empty lot and 40 acres of pine trees around a black lake. I was okay with that. Some places should be erased completely. 5 years later, I'm still in Colorado. Still work at the shipping company. Still live in the same house in the mountains. The nightmares stopped after the trials ended. My mother visits twice a year now, seems lighter somehow, like she finally let go of something heavy she'd been carrying too long. Sometimes I get Christmas cards from families whose cases got solved because of Clay's files. Pictures of kids who got to grow up with parents they thought were dead, or grandparents who finally learned what happened to missing grandchildren. Those cards go on my refrigerator. Reminders that some good came from all of it. But mostly I just live a normal life. Clock in, clock out. Come home to a house where the worst thing in the basement is a broken water heater. That's enough for me. More than enough. I never want to inherit anything again.